morning, everybody. Today is the day where the coastal people meet the mountain people. I mean, they met in person, but now we try to also discuss what we're taking away from each other. And this morning we're starting with the coast. And I myself, I am a coastal person, I would say. I have some knowledge about the mountains and I travel in the mountains, but I never really dealt with adaptation to climate change and mountain issues. I know a lot about coasts. So do my dear panelists here, I assume, and they are working for long on coastal issues. And what we did, the Germans from the coast, coming from the coast, we came some days before that workshop, and we traveled a little bit in the area. One reason was, of course, we are hungry for the beauty of the Rocky Mountains to see them. But the other interest was, and we had Horst Stehr with us, he's a geographer, to understand a little bit about the geomorphological situation in the Rockies, how this compares to our own mountains, but also to visualize the environment. And I just want to highlight, because this panel is very brief and I want to give the time to the panelists, two visual impressions we had. One was, it was around the area, when we left Boulder, we came down to Colorado Springs and then approaching Salida. And in this area, we just, I think it was Sandra and me, looking out of the window of our little minibus and saying, hey look, that looks like a dike in the mountain. There was a rock shaped like a dike. And we immediately started to question Horst. I mean, is it a coincidence or why is it shaped this way? But we started to think about how they are protecting themselves against erosion. You know, it was a connotation. We saw a dike, we started to talk in the car what they do here with erosion and, you know, sudden floods coming from the water running down the mountains. The second one was a little bit later when we approached the mining and silver area around Silverton and Uray. We say some houses, they are standing on stilts. We say, wait a second, this is not possible. I mean, they don't need stilts here. It must be something different. But we remembered in the coastal areas, having houses on stilts definitely is an adaptation measure. So I want to leave it with that, but just highlight it's important to visualize things. And when we talk with our coastal people, going back to Germany or elsewhere, we need to tell them what mountain regions are. They should ideally see it themselves before they connect to the idea of taking ideas from mountain adaptation to coastal adaptation. So this was a sort of an introduction. I hope you're all with us now. We are going to talk about what we can take away for our coastal people from the experience from yesterday, from what we heard or saw. And I briefly want to introduce my panelists here. I have Sandra Enderwitz. Sandra is from the Bay of Kiel Alliance, if you might recall already. And she's working with around 17 communities on a daily basis and trying to coordinate the adaptation activities and to make this network more productive and linking to other networks. So she's very much grounded and working in the area. Jeff from the Chesapeake Conservancy is working very much on the political and the local level, bringing interests together and trying to line out potentials and new opportunities. And Raghu, I'm not allowed to say you're a scientist, I'm allowed to say you're a modeler. And you will explain why is that. But he's with the University of Maryland and obviously knows a great deal about the interface, science, and users. So my first question goes to Sandra. I would like to know, Sandra, what you took away personally from yesterday. And I want to give you the time to really let us know what you felt, what you experienced, and what you think you can bring forward.
Okay, thanks, Britt. Hello. Well, the first lessons I've learned is that really mountain and coasts are, of course, very different. The system from the United States and Germany or the European systems are different. Still, I think I've learned some very helpful lessons yet. I think the two sectors that are hit we have in common is the tourism sector and the water sector. Both those sectors are the most affected ones, I guess, and we have in common. So regarding tourism, I like what Bill said yesterday. Adaptation in tourism, we need to develop also, we have to adjust tourism, we have to make attractive offers despite of what we are maybe losing. In Germany or on the Baltic coast, we have the problem that we have a loss of beaches, and it's very due to erosion. and it's very expensive for the communities to refill those beaches every year. So a solution could be to develop the countryside and not to focus only on beach tourism as we do now. So like Mike Auerbach says, change happens all the time. Industries and cities within the past 100 years have changed. So if we don't expect that everything stays the same all the time, we might find solutions. And this is, I think, the biggest problem, because the heads are thick, so it's difficult to explain and raise awareness that maybe the business models we have now are not lasting so for all the time. And instead of building higher dikes all the time, maybe develop different business models. And then coming back to what we saw when I saw, oh, this looks like a huge dike here on the foot of the mountains, what is it? And it turned out to be alluvial fence. So, but it looked like a giant dike, so Jacobus Hofstede told me that this is a model that the Netherlands are planning, and it's been already realized in Japan. And these are dikes about 15 meters of height. And the interesting thing is that they're not just dikes, they're not only for coastal protection.
There's a deer, sorry, we just have to acknowledge it.
Don't get turned into a deer.
Looking for brain food.
So make adaptation measures multifunctional. So in those giant dikes, they are included hotels, apartments, parking spots, and so on. So of course we're still far away from this in Germany because it's a huge investment. But maybe this is also a possibility to involve the private sector in adaptation measures, which is in Germany at least desirable, but hasn't happened so far, because climate adaptation is nothing where on the short perspective businesses expect to gain money, not like we heard yesterday from from the skiing business. They adapt, and they adapt because they already have financial impacts. They feel already the impacts from climate change, and this is the driver to adapt. And we don't have this on the community level yet. The impacts are still very low, and just expecting impacts within 50 or 100 years doesn't make them act now, because they need a lot of money for this and they don't have it. And this leads me to my last, maybe the biggest lesson, the Aspenization of adaptation. That communities with a lot of resources are more adaptable than others. And I think this is a problem we have to focus on, because it's exactly the same in Germany. We have the island of Sylt, which is comparable to Aspen. A lot of rich people have their second homes there, and it gains a lot of taxes. So the private sector as well as the state makes a lot of effort to protect the coast there, to adapt into climate change and to the rising sea level, because it gains a lot of taxes. And we have also Timmendorfer Strand, which is on the Baltic, is a similar situation. But in the other communities, there is no money for this. The communities don't have the money. There are no private investors. There are not worthy houses to be protected. So I think maybe we have to focus more on those communities and help them to adapt to climate change as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, for the initial contribution. And I want to hang on one thing you said. The impacts we are feeling in the Baltic Sea, they are not that strong yet. Correct me, Jacobus and Horst, but that's what we gather from our communities. And it's different in the Chesapeake. That's what I gathered from my field studies there. It's very difficult. It's almost dramatic in some areas. And that's where Jeff is working around the Chesapeake. And I would like to know from Jeff, what opportunities do you see to use information results from here for your work on making the political level in the Chesapeake Bay more aware and more reactive to local needs? I know a lot is going on, but how could you build that in under more dramatic situations than we have yet in the Baltic?
I think it's going to be difficult because the major changes that people are seeing now are typically the result of very high tides or hurricanes and storm surge coming through, and those have been occurring for a long time, hundreds of years. As long as people have lived there, they've had these experiences, and it hasn't become frequent enough for them to kind of make that mental jump between this is something that's happened before to this is something that I need to address going into the future. People have adapted in the past by elevating houses when they need to. They've done small-scale things. I think what we need to do is start to figure out what the major drivers for change, the major motivations for change are within the community. Looking at coastal resilience, so not focusing as much on climate change, but saying, storm surge is something that you deal with. This is going to, amplify the effects of storm surge. It's not a problem all on its own, but it works into things that you're already doing. Looking at regulations that are already in place, like floodplain regulations, emergency management regulations, and saying how can we make small changes to things that are already on the books that you're used to build in that extra level of protection as things change. I think it was interesting listening to the conversations, listening to the executives from Aspen ski company talking about, they have such a strong motivation to change. They're seeing an impact on skier days. I think in the mountain system in general, you're starting to see impacts sooner. And maybe I've been spending too much time with Doug, but I think in the coastal system, the major changes that you're going to be seeing are still far enough off that people don't have the immediate driver to change. That it's still something that's in the future. There's the opportunity to be proactive, but there's not necessarily an immediate push to make changes.
What about incentives given by wrong incentives, I would say? As a European, I can say that, I guess. Wrong incentives being given for people not to act. Is there something system imminent, which calls for change too?
I think there's a lot of incentives in place. The National Flood Insurance Program, the way it's currently set up, is encouraging people to live in vulnerable coastal areas. Looking at Superstorm Sandy last year and the amount of financing that's going into rebuilding houses that were taken down by storm surge. You're rebuilding houses in the exact place that they were. If you want to get your payment, you have to have your permit in hand. And the fastest way to get your permit in hand is to rebuild your house exactly how it was before and to not make any changes. So you have these programs in place that, are intended to protect people living in the coastal area, are intended to, provide some protection, but at the same time, as conditions are changing, it's going to bring up some large financial issues. As storms happen more frequently, as you have larger payouts for storms, there's a big question of where is this money going to come from?
But still yet, I will open the floor, we will open very soon for joint discussion. I just wanted to have some statements from our panelists. And one question for me, but still you work on those issues.
Yeah.
So how do you get things on the ground? How do you get
it's appealing to the local interests and figuring out what the motivation is for that change on a local level. Oftentimes it's having a local champion, someone in the local government, someone who's respected within the community, who kind of comes out and makes a stand saying this is an issue that we need to address and that we need to look at. Within Maryland, there's been a lot of planning work going on, but there hasn't been a ton of implementation yet. It's a lot of getting ready to start to do something, getting the plans in place, but there hasn't been a lot of action yet.
Well, what would you take away from what you saw yesterday? I just would like to hear it.
I think it definitely in Aspen, there's a number of strong community members who have made this a priority. And have said, this is impacting our way of life, this has the potential to, and we have the opportunity to get out ahead of the problem and actually make a difference. And I think that's something that, is very strong and will motivate people to change. is by having, you know, the bottom up integration with the community members, as well as the support from, you know, the mayor and the town council and all of that.
Okay, thanks. Now, we have the modeler here who knows a lot about the impacts. He can tell us a lot of what's going to happen, what happened already. And I'm particularly interested, this is the focus of our session too, to understand how science can communicate those issues to the wider public. I know you're not doing that daily, but you're involved in it. Could you just help us out and give us your insights based on what you experienced yesterday, please?
Yeah, so as the only Indian here, I want to thank you for coming to my ancestral land. But I think the big thing I saw is this mountain community here. It's more of a lifestyle issues they are facing. Whereas in the coastal community, at least in the Chesapeake Bay, there is a lot of population growth. People want to get closer to the water, and sea level rise is such an potent issue. It gets mentioned all the time. So it's somewhat of an existential crisis, especially for many islands that are sinking. But there are people on Smith Island that will call me and say, you don't know what you're talking about because we haven't seen a change in 60 years. So there are regional differences in the sea level rise, even within the bay, even though overall it's rising at twice the global rate. And now USGS has produced a paper in Nature recently saying the acceleration of sea level rise from North Carolina to Massachusetts is 3 to 4 times the global acceleration. So how do you communicate these kind of issues? There are some that come out of nowhere, like Norfolk has one of the biggest Navy bases, and they are very much worried about sea level rise. So people here, the ski industry, immediately gets hit by changes in snowfall. So that's similar to them. They are immediately worried about things. But Navy is not, on the other hand, asking us to help them. They are doing something internally that we don't know. What they asked us to help us with instead was to look at the salinity front at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, because they said when the submarines come in, if they try to surface, the periscope gets damaged by the salinity front. So it's a very different issue than the climate change issue. But on the other hand, there's Blue Plain wastewater treatment sitting right at the Chesapeake Bay, and they saw the 2011 flood in Queensland, which wiped out the wastewater treatment plant, and it'll take them 3 to 5 years to rebuild. So far, Blue Plain had not thought about this issue, so suddenly they started calling us saying, we need more reliable projections for the future, not just sea level rise, but storm surge, because with each centimeter of sea level rise, you're going to have several kilometers more storm surge. And the predictions are that more and more hurricanes are going to come into the Chesapeake Bay as we go into the future. Tornadoes are already increasing. So the issues are kind of more existential. And there we tend to split the issue into social sensitivities, biophysical sensitivities, and climate issues. Here it's being done a bit more ad hoc, I think. So the communication here between people of the community and the decision makers and federal and local agencies seems to be much closer, whereas Chesapeake Bay, for example, is being affected by upstate Pennsylvania and New York, who never see the Chesapeake Bay. So you cannot convince them that things are going bad here because they're using too much fertilizer. So there is, and also the political views of DC and Maryland are very different than Virginia. So even those come into play. So we worked through something called Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which represents about 22 local governments, over 300 decision makers at local and federal levels. But this communication it's not as strong as it is here. So how to make it stronger basically gets into issues of different political views. So the social interface seems easier. So from doing the prediction side, the biggest challenge was that initially this was led by modelers like me, but we had to realize that this is actually a social science problem. So we had to bring anthropologists, social scientists, and School of Public Health to lead the contacts with the public, including information. So that has helped a lot.
Thank you very much, Raghu. I think the panel quite reflected clearly all those similarities we do have, and the same risk, like droughts, fires can wipe out a whole region, floods can wipe out villages. The national, regional, local levels, this is important, where we deal on a really, really local day-to-day basis, and there the issues differ, ranging from political, social, historical, background. So with this information, I want to give back to you all to discuss with our panelists in the remaining time how we can make productive use of the difference we get of the similarities. What does it mean for our daily interaction and work? And so please, the floor is open for your questions and comments. Yes, please.
Raghu, the last thing you said about, at first you tried to reach out into the political council, and that didn't go so well. And then you realized that reaching through an intermediary.
John, could you please speak up a little?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Look in that direction.
I was asking about what Raghu said at the end about trying to reach out into the political process, the Council of Governments associated with Chesapeake. And that didn't work very well. So he realized that there was a need for an intermediary. And the intermediary made up of like health departments and so on. And I was wondering, do they then give you feedback about the kinds of questions that they get? And do they then connect with the science?
Yes, I mean, it's not like the connections with the governments didn't work. It's just that it's a much longer process. In fact, they were very good with coming up with a table of their needs in terms of exactly what they need in terms of precipitation changes, temperature changes, sea level changes, extreme events, and so on. But when they went back and tried to introduce that information into the decision-making process, it seems like it's not that easy, basically because of differences in the way they think about it. The health issue, Cliff Mitchell, for example, who's the head of Maryland Department of Health and I think it's called mental hygiene, is much more connected into communities which are affected by things like eating contaminated fish or ozone quality and asthma morbidity, things like that. So it's easier for him to convert that information into local governments issuing health warnings or asking people to take public transportation. These are people are much more open to these informations coming from the Department of Health and the information going from us to him. And it also helps to collect information to see if our predictions are right. Like Department of Natural Resources can go and measure whether actually pathogen contents are higher, harmful algal blooms are higher, and so on. So this end of the system seems to work much faster and the information propagation is much easier. Whereas the decision making on the political side involve longer term issues, probably needs much more discussion among themselves. So it's not even like they're worried about the uncertainty in the information. It's just how to use it and whether they will make decisions based on that or not.
Okay. I see at least 3 hands going up and 4 now. Mike came first, then you, then Bill, and then Andreas.
I want to ask a question about what conditions justify what strategies. And the case that maybe Jeff could comment a bit more on is when we were doing this work in the comparative project with Goodit in Germany and the Chesapeake and Carolinas, one of the things we noticed in Anne Arundel County, where Jeff lives, is that there was an attempt to make a sea level rise adaptation plan. And it was rejected because some people didn't want to talk about sea level rise. But then the exact same measures that were in that were represented later, called, I think, flood mitigation.
Yep.
And everybody went, oh, that's great, let's do all of that.
Yep.
And so changing the label, everybody went fine. What justifies that as a strategy? That is, when do you risk appearing being disingenuous with what you're calling something?
I don't know.
Or is it okay to make switches like that? No harm, no foul.
I don't know if it's disingenuous. I mean, my personal feeling is if you're getting to the same end, a lot of climate adaptation, at least in the coastal zone, is going to address multiple issues. And some of them are going to be shorter term, some of them are going to be longer term. So I completely agree with renaming it flood mitigation because that's something that people could relate to. And it's something that we've said multiple times in the past couple of days in the Hamburg meeting, is you need to go to the public and you need to talk to them in language that they understand, with messages that they understand, with something they can connect to. So in this case, in 2003, Hurricane Isabel came through. There's about 9 feet of storm surge in Annapolis. If anyone's ever been there, all of City Dock, the area right in the center of town, people were kayaking down the streets. So that's something very recent in people's minds. They can relate to it, they know what happened to it. The section of Eastport, the kind of historic area where Mike used to live, is very low lying. That was all flooded. So when you go into these areas and you say, we want to work on flood mitigation to make sure that these buildings, these houses, these roads are going to be safe well into the future, as conditions change, to build in that extra bit of protection, people can wrap their minds around that because they can understand, they've experienced it before. If you go and you say, we need to work on something that's going to be happening 50 years from now that you've never experienced before, even though they may have in one way or another, in their minds they haven't, that's much harder to wrap their minds around.
So even though I may be doing something for one reason, it's okay to cite it another reason for it.
If it addresses another issue, I personally don't see what the issue would be with that. If it's a,
Can we ask just for
Please.
clarification here? I'm having a hard time understanding how flood mitigation would be an adaptive measure for sea level rise.
So part of what it was the 100-year floodplain hadn't been revised since the 1970s. So there had been sea level rise that had occurred. The flood elevations had been revised, and they needed to basically redo all of the floodplain regulations for building structures, for how you're going to elevate houses, dry waterproof or wet waterproof houses. So all of these things that will address many of the, allow adaptation for if you do have sea level rise or a storm surge coming through, you don't completely lose a house. You kind of minimize what your losses will be. They're going to be, what people in Anne Arundel County did is they said, we already need to update our floodplain regulations. Understanding that there is variability, that there's, some sort of change happening, we want to look into the future instead of being, again, relying on data that's 30 years in the past, 40 years in the past. We're going to build in the extra level of protection. So we call it freeboard. So we're going to build in an extra foot of freeboard. So you have the new base flood elevation, for which is what FEMA determines as the 100-year floodplain. They say we're going to elevate to a foot or 2 feet above that to build in that extra amount of protection.
So what's common is there's going to be more water, more places, more of the time. The good news is that will help some things for a while.
Right.
The bad news is sea level rise is not like a storm.
Yep.
It's going to be a permanent change. But I guess what I'm hearing from you is it's okay, we'll get to that later. And that's okay. I mean, that's the answer.
I mean,
we'll get to that part of it later. Let's start this process.
I think starting the process is very important. Building in kind of the comfort level of having these conversations is very important. And if you are addressing the issues that you're going to be seeing in the short term, those are the most pressing. And you need to build into that over the long term, adapting to the higher levels of sea level rise. But if you're addressing the major problems in the short term, starting that conversation, I think that's one of the most important steps.
But this is still adaptation, not mitigation.
Right.
So your point was that the word mitigation was introduced to essentially justify adaptation measures.
In some people's mind, yes.
Yeah.
So I have 3 more questions to handle, and we are short in time, and maybe we take a bit off from our
Can I make a
break.
quick
And there's a comment also, so but let's
Yeah, I mean,
finish that and then we move
The
on.
idea that sea level rise is a permanent change is kind of that's much before that permanent change comes. The storm surge issue is going to be hitting much harder. So I think a lot of the mitigation adaptation will come from people getting hit again and again with storm surges and inundation, I think.
Okay, you had a question.
As a follow-up, quickly, several of the examples I'm going to give today are about teasing out these relative impacts in time. But yes, my question is for Raghu is, let's see, so we were talking about the role of science in communicating and being effective in local policy, and my question for you is about scale, because, okay, let's say that what you proposed about having an intermediary is effective, and that works. I don't know that that's so yet, but if that were to work where you've got your sociologists and the public health people and everybody else helping translate that in a way, helping understand how to do that, how does this scale? We've got hundreds, maybe thousands of places that need to do this, and we can't say that they should all go relying on a university who's going to go find a team of people to communicate and then help that work. We need all of the towns to do this. What do we do?
When I say communication, it's almost not like telling them how much sea level, showing them IPCC graphs and communicating them better. I think that has been a disaster. What we mean is much more asking them what kind of information they think they need. That's where the regional specificity comes in. What a person in the front of the Chesapeake Bay wants depends on how rich they are and whether they're worried about their $1 million house or whether they're worried about their hut. And what somebody else wants in Baltimore is slightly different. So it's much more about asking them, this is what anthropologists and social scientists are doing, what they're experiencing, the so-called experiential knowledge, and then asking them what kind of information do you think will really help you.
Thank you.
So that's very different than just showing them more graphs.
I think Bill, you came next.
I want to raise a cautionary note. I have to say where I'm coming from. If you hang around with the attribution people much, Marty Hurling and Randy Dole, and you listen to Tom Carl, and you have to recognize that you can't say that storminess is expected to increase, nor has it increased, nor is Sandy the new norm. There's no consensus that storm surge without sea level rise would increase. It might decrease under an anthropogenic warming. Storminess might decrease. There's almost nothing solid on thunderstorms or mid-latitude storms. There's a bit of evidence, freshwater flooding in the mid-latitudes, right? Especially the northern hemisphere, more intense rainfall events. But boy, in the tropical cyclone and storminess world, several comments already have kind of accepted the notion that there's going to be more of this in the future. There's not a scientific foundation for that. So we have to be, certainly sea level, current storm surge climatology on top of sea level, that's why sea level is so useful in a way, because we know which direction it goes, but you have to be careful to tell people we're not necessarily expecting more storm surges lacking sea level rise, or in addition to sea level rise. You get my point?
Yeah, I mean that discussion can take all day. I know Marty very well, I know all that work.
But you mentioned tornadoes, yeah. And Hurling has looked at tornadoes really hard.
All those statistics are global, right? Locally, you can go to this is what we mean by experiential knowledge. Over Maryland, if you look in the last 20 years, there have been more tornadoes.
We have to give you space for bilateral conversation later on for the sake of time, and give Andreas the last question, and then I have to sum up and we hand over to the next speaker.
I think my comment is a warning, because if we continue with this dialogue, we are going to induce coastal communities to walk into a deadly trap. Looking at the ways in which you respond to storm surges, by firming up the infrastructure, by raising the levels here and there, induces the communities to invest even more in the areas that will be lost to the sea sooner or later anyway. How long does it take, Jeff? That was one of your questions. How much time does it take? In the 1200s, the second most important port city in the United Kingdom, a place that's called Winchelsea. It was the largest trading port because it was close to France, and was the second largest military port. And a series of hurricanes coming through the English channels, and they wasted a whole generation, always firming up their infrastructure, rebuilding everything after every storm. It's after one generation had done that, they realized that they couldn't hold the ground on which they had built their city. It took them another generation to work out what to do next, petitioning the king to give them land on the hill nearby so that they could build a new town. And that then they had to do, everybody who had a business, every church that was there, everybody was allowed to build a new home. They had the resources to do it because they were a rich trading community. And in 1285, they were standing on the wall of their new built town on the hill, looking down on the coast when a hurricane took what was left of their old city. It took 3 generations, and this global community doesn't have 3 generations to prepare for what's coming.
Okay.
Not a question.
Thank you all very much. It was a statement, but I know Andreas and they're always historically profound and good, and I'm a historian, so that's okay. But before we think about doom and gloom, which is there, I would rather prefer to take as a final sentence what Raghu said, and I very much believe too, people on the ground matter, their opinion and experience matter. And I've been talking to people in the Chesapeake Bay, and they said, you know, Hoopers Island is gone. It's just gone. My family lived there 3 generations ago. It's gone. We know we can't live there anymore, and they're built elsewhere already. So take into consideration the local knowledge and capabilities and abilities, and for the science user interface, ask them what they need. And I'm looking very much forward now to have Horst from the Baltic Sea to give us more details on what our German guys over there feeling and thinking, and what's the situation in Germany. And yes.